Saints of the Americas is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church celebrated in the Americas. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Welcome to our show. We're going to begin by talking about St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. Many of us are familiar with St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. She has an interesting background, but also a wonderful life that's significant for us here in the United States.
Well, she's born in the United States, and that's what makes her so special to us from the very beginning. As we move ahead in her life, she will be the first native-born citizen of the United States to be canonized a saint. But she was born just 2 years prior to the signing of the Declaration of Independence in August of 1774 in New York City. She was the daughter of a very prominent physician and professor. Her maiden name was Bailey. And so she's raised to be kind of a debutante. She marries a young man, William Seton. There's a good amount of wealth. They're leading a very good life. They have 5 children. One of the things, unfortunately, that happens is he suffers some financial losses. Those are compounded by poor health that kind of eat away at their resources. We know that the story goes that they traveled to Italy to visit friends, and 6 weeks after their arrival there, now again, this is back, people didn't just take a weekend trip or a week's vacation. When you would travel to Europe, you would be gone for several months, and you had to have wealth to do that, obviously. So they arrive in Italy, and 6 weeks after his arrival, he dies. And but along the way, she's already dealing with a desire to come to the Catholic faith. They are Catholic friends that they had stayed with there. Certainly that must have helped her in those early days of suffering his loss. And when she returns to the United States, she is already herself a convicted Catholic, we're told, that she invites these convictions into her heart. She meets great opposition from her Episcopalian family and friends, and regardless of that, though, she seeks to be baptized, and she is baptized on March 4th of 1805, gives her a new lease on life, but there's that rejection from all of her family and friends that pushes her forward in a new way.
Let's talk briefly about that whole sense that those who are not cradle-born Catholics are usually loved into the church. And so her presence, her family's presence in Italy, where she would have experienced certainly Catholicism at its highest, she would have known what that faith was all about. Now, certainly the Episcopalian religion would have been extremely close to Catholicism in many ways in celebration of certain sacraments. But when we talk about embracing the Catholic faith, she's really loved into that faith in spite of, as you had mentioned, opposition from her friends who were of another faith. And that oftentimes happens when we talk about sharing the faith or inviting others into the fold. There's those, perhaps family members, perhaps it's a cultural or custom thing that, or a tribal thing where there's great opposition. And so even in her time, civilized time, she experiences this tremendous opposition, but that doesn't stop her. That doesn't stop her for continuing her desire not only to be Catholic, but to engage in Catholic teaching, Catholic ministry and mission. So let's tell the folks that are with us where this mission, this faith really leads her.
Well, and as you said, she has to, as we all do, have to make that decision to continue that love affair, if you will, that being loved into the church, but then living out that love affair with Christ through the specific tenets and teachings of the Catholic faith, or to kind of give in, if you will, and go along with her family and friends. She feels abandoned by them. And so there is a sense of rejection. that she feels, but again, it's that love that moves her forward. And so it brings her to the Sulpician sisters in Baltimore. And she's invited by the superior of their order to start a school for girls in the city. And so we know that this is what she does. She takes this call to develop a school that will help to educate children much as her own. She's left with these children. And so the school prospers, and eventually the Sulpician superior, with the approval of Bishop John Carroll, they gave Elizabeth and her assistants a rule of life. And so what that means is she then is forming a religious community that will continue to foster and grow these specific charisms, which we see most especially the development of a Catholic school system in the United States.
And of course, we know that she does found the Sisters of Charity, founded really by St. Vincent de Paul initially, but she works very closely in this congregation to reach out to the African Americans, to the Native Americans, to those really who are less fortunate. We also see that she opens up orphanages in Philadelphia, in New York City, and then she dies in 1821, but her legacy really continued. People we know continue to reach out to those who are disadvantaged. In future segments, we'll talk also about those whose ministry was among the Native Americans, and we have spoken about that, but also among the African Americans and how crucial that ministry is. We know that she was beatified by John the 23rd in 1963, perhaps his last beatification prior to his death. And then she was canonized by Pope Paul VI in 1975. I'd like to share with the folks that are with us the opening prayer of her Mass. It says, Lord God, you blessed Elizabeth Seton with gifts of grace as wife and mother, educator and foundress, so that she might spend her life in service to your people. Through her example and prayers, may we learn to express our love for you in love for our fellow men and women. So there's this whole sense that this ministry that she began, she encourages, and the church encourages her people to continue. Just one final comment briefly about Elizabeth Ann Seton.
Well, I do think that among her many blessings and gifts really was that desire to educate all of God's children. Knowledge is power. And we see that by her reaching out to those who were thought less fortunate, those who were ostracized from typical society, African Americans, Native Americans, impoverished people of different immigrant backgrounds, it was trying to give them an equal footing in the world and recognizing that we're all called to take our faith and reason to have this knowledge and love of the Lord and put it into practice.
Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. The Society of St. Paul announces a new book called Saints of the USA by Brother Marco Buccarelli. This book, for children ages 6 and up, will fascinate young readers as they learn more about the saints of North America. Those who read it will meet 10 figures who have lived lives of holiness, as well as the Immaculate Conception of Mary, patroness of the United States. The book can be found at St. Paul's Books and Gifts at 926 Boardman Poland Road on Route 224. The store is open Monday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. or call 330-953-2443 or email at stpaulsbookstore@gmail.com and learn more about these saints of our time.
I am Marino.
Yo soy Marino.
Marino, an American Catholic organization of priests and brothers, has been reaching out to those in need for nearly 100 years in 26 countries throughout the world. Missioners, workers, volunteers, supporters, we are all Marino.
I'm Father Mike, and I am Marino.
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 Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about St. Katherine Drexel. We know that she was born in 1858, approximately the middle of the 19th century, and then lives until the middle of the 20th century. And so she is a person of means, and we see that this wealth that she has had enables her to carry on her mission. Let's talk about her early life.
Well, as you said, she's born just a few years before the outbreak of the Civil War in the North, Philadelphia. She is the heiress to a banking fortune. We know that her mother dies when she's very young, but her father remarries, and by all accounts, she had a very loving stepmother, very good to Katherine in raising her and the family. We know that unfortunately, her father and stepmother also die, and so her family, she becomes the next generation, her and siblings, to inherit a vast wealth, a great deal of money. But we know that Katherine is searching for purpose in her life. We know that even as a layperson, and because of her wealth, she's able to travel to Europe, she's able to visit the Vatican. We know that she at one point then does visit with Pope Leo XIII and is seeking some direction in her life. And the direction that he offers her is to reach out to those who are the least fortunate in her own land. As I mentioned, she's born 2 years before the outbreak of the Civil War. We know that there is the expansion of the United States that is going on during the time of her early life. And so if you mention Civil War and the American expansion, the two groups that are the most oppressed are Native Americans and African Americans. And so Leo XIII's call to her is to use her wealth, to use her power, and also to use her faith to reach out to those two specific groups of people.
Let's talk specifically about how the church influences her people to engage in the work of the church. For example, we know that many of the saints that we have talked about in this series were given direction and encouragement by the Pope himself or by a bishop in a local diocese to surface this particular need and to respond to that need. And how important is it for us to kind of surface the needs of our local churches so that we can encourage our people to reach out and minister to those particular needs? We see this in the life of Katherine. We've seen it in the lives of many of the saints that we spoke about. Let's talk about her early life as a novice with the Sisters of Charity in Pittsburgh, and then eventually founding her own congregation.
Well, as you mentioned, she begins with the Sisters of Mercy in Pittsburgh in 1891. And then she becomes the foundress of her own religious community. In 1915, she established Xavier University for African Americans in New Orleans, and it's estimated that during her own lifetime, she spent approximately $12 million of her wealth. We're putting that back in the dollar amounts then. We could only imagine what that sum would be worth today. For the apostolate to serve the Native American and African American people. So we know that what was hoped for was to harness her abilities and her gifts and her talents. So even though she could have done some good as Miss Katherine Drexel, society norms of that time would have been that she would have eventually married. Given the laws and dictates of the time, would she have even been in control of her own wealth? Or would this be something that her husband would make decisions for? So it's very interesting that the Pope leads her in this direction to become a woman religious, who you think then of stripping yourself of all your wealth, but still in control of her wealth, using it through the congregation to serve and to minister. But again, it is the church surfacing these needs and inviting her to discover new and many ways in which to meet those needs that she might not, even with her own wealth and her own prestige, have been able to do that.
And how unusual it would have been, not only at the time, but but unusual circumstances for anyone entering religious life to have these tremendous means of finances and wealth, and to be able to use those even serving as a religious woman. We see that, while she had a willingness to use her money for the good of the people in the church, she still lived an example of poverty of spirit, of detachment of goods of this world. So there was a sense that she used her wealth not for herself or her congregation, but to promote the charism and the work of her congregation itself. We know that she's really kind of contemporary when we talk about the particular needs that go on here in the United States and really in countries around the world. We experience unemployment, we experience homelessness. There's a sense of prejudice and racial injustice that continues in our world, and especially here in our own country. How does her responsibilities as a religious woman reaching out to these people help us in reaching out to minister to these particular needs?
Well, I think with Katherine especially, it's really hard to separate the religious woman and the heiress. So I think for us, because it's too easy to dismiss one or the other. It's too easy to say, well, I'm not a member of a religious community. I've not taken those vows. I'm living in the real world. And I have to encounter all these things. So it was easy for her to love everybody and forgive everybody and serve everybody. Or it's easy to say, oh, well, she had all that money. It was really easy for her to do it. In both of those, there were great challenges. We have to understand, even in the church during her time, there would have been many who would have been calling to not minister to those communities. They would have seen African Americans as less of a person. They would have seen Native Americans as heathens. And why work with them? Take care of the people we have right here in Philadelphia, or right here in our own area. There would have also been those of her stature and her position that felt she was betraying their class by ministering. So I think in both of bringing those two together in Katherine, it's a challenge to us that whatever our resources are and whatever our station in life, we are called as Christians to love all of God's people and to minister to the most neglected in society.
We like to close with the opening prayer of her Mass, which says, "Ever-loving God, you called St. Katherine Drexel to teach the message of the gospel and to bring the life of the Eucharist to the African American and Native American peoples. By her prayers and example, enable us to work for justice among the poor and the oppressed, and keep us undivided in love in the Eucharistic community of your church." We certainly try to continue that ministry and mission among the poor, especially those who are disadvantaged. Stay with us. We have another saint in just a moment. We'll be right back. The Society of St. Paul announces a new book on Louis and Zélie Martin, parents of St. Therese of the Child Jesus. The book focuses on her parents' journey towards sanctity in their family life and social commitments. This book was compiled for couple and group sharing and is meant to strengthen the journey of all in marriage and family life towards sanctity and holiness. The book can be found at St. Paul's Books and Gifts at 926 Boardman Poland Road on Route 224, located across from the Olive Garden restaurant. The store is open Monday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. or call 330-953-2443 or email at stpaulsbookstore@gmail.com and learn more about these witnesses of our time.
33 million Americans have descended into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
My name is Sister Mary Claudina, and I run a home for abandoned children. I want to take care of children who have no parents, because luckily I come from a very loving family. There are 8 of us. And I remember when one of my cousins got sick, and she called my mom and said, "Mom, the doctor has said that I might not have too long to live. Will you please raise my 3 children for me?" I remember we had a meeting at home, and my dad called a meeting, and my mom was explaining to all of us. And my father said, this powerful word, he said, "We already have 8. What is 3 more?" We learn to care for each other, to love each other, to fight among each other, to make up, to forgive, to just to be a family. And I think that's what I learned from home, and I wanted to share that with children who do not have that love and that opportunity just to know what a family is all about.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about St. Rose Philippine Duchesne. Interesting life, also a woman of wealth and background, but also a tremendous woman of prayer. And we'll see that a little later on when we talk about her ministry. Let's talk about her early life first.
Well, she was born in Grenoble, France. As you said, a woman of wealth. Her family was aristocrats. She, however, though, manifested certain religious traits at an early age, and she had a great zeal for foreign missions. So we've talked about some other saints that even at an early age felt this call to go and to minister to other lands, to minister to other people, to bring that word of God. So it's really hard in a young person's mindset to not only have their own faith, but that desire and that zeal to spread that faith with others. We know that this strong attraction to religious life brought her to certain practices of self-denial, of going without. This again would have been a little bit of a challenge in the world and the trappings in which she lived. We know, though, that she had above all a very deep-seated devotion to the Sacred Heart and to the Blessed Sacrament. We know that at the age of 18, then she joins the Visitation Nuns. So again, her family, although she's on the line to perhaps continue that aristocratic line to marry someone, she does join this religious order. However, the outbreak of the French Revolution interrupts this religious life, and they have to disband. And so even in that being disbanded and not being part of that community, she dedicates herself to prayer of peace, and that she's going to live this type of life until the community can come back together. So she is working for and praying for peace. She, in her own way, does little works of charity and acts of kindness, always hoping that they're going to come back together. They don't. The community does not come back together. It is not reassembled, and so with all efforts failed, she ends up joining the Religious of the Sacred Heart in 1800.
It's interesting because once she finally finds herself in this new religious community, she also finds a new mission in life, a new ministry, which brings her here to the United States. And so she does come to New Orleans with 4 other religious women, and that was at the age of 49 in 1818. And so the bishop basically sends this group to St. Charles, Missouri, to establish a school. And many of the sisters who really did come to the United States came as educators, came as those people who bishops saw as religious who could share the faith to the young children. And we talked about this in some other episodes. There were certain religious communities that really came to the United States, but their charism wasn't education or healthcare, and so they had struggles finding their niche in the local church and local diocese. But we see St. Rose Duchesne and the other sisters that came with her, their niche was very simple to find. It was in education. And so we see basically this continue and move on to St. Louis, Missouri, where she establishes an orphanage. And so that whole sense that she is there with some of her other religious women to work not only in education, but also among the orphans. And then where do we find her going next? Where does this community then grow and expand?
Well, as you mentioned, we have the founding of the school and then the orphanage in St. Louis. We know that it's there that she comes in contact with the first Jesuit priest. And they're assigned to Missouri, and what happens is their mission is kind of faltering and failing. And so what she does is she offers herself and her community in any way possible to help them. And so in sharing the few resources that they have, in sharing their community, they're kind of able to rescue them and to continue this ministry. It is interesting to note, though, when we're looking at her life, she really doesn't arrive in the United States until 49. Right. The age of 49. So, she joined a community at 18. So we're talking about 30 years, partly the time of the French Revolution, but then other years in France, honing her skills, living religious life, working in education. But then, to think at almost 50, starting a whole new career in a whole new country, and then being moved about. But that is the call of the religious and the call of missionaries, if you will. We know that also then we find there's a missionary to the Native Americans, and we've seen that theme throughout this show. Each of the religious has been called to serving these other individuals. And that is what kind of has that transition to, you mentioned other religious orders. A lot of the bishops of the time just wanted to take care of the populations they had. They were coming from either Ireland or France or later on from other European countries, and they really just saw the sisters as, we have these already made Catholics we need to educate, and some of their parents are going to die, so we need orphanages. I mean, really, to be rather crass, that's what they wanted them. They were worker bees to educate and to care for children that were left alone, but the already made Catholics. The bishops really didn't have a mindset, or many of them had a mindset in expanding the faith. It is the religious communities themselves that feel this call to do that. And so we see her kind of moving forward into these missionaries and into ministering to the Native American communities.
And we see this this ministry really continuing not only in her life, because as I had mentioned at the beginning of this particular segment, we saw her not only as a person of wealth, but also as a person of prayer. And so that was how those that were ministered to really saw her as a tremendous woman of prayer. And that ministry continued. They really did love and respect her. But eventually she was called back to Missouri, where she spent the last 10 years of her life basically in prayer before the Blessed Sacrament. So we see kind of like an inclusion, a really coming back to what was the beginning of her life, beginning with devotion and prayer to the Lord, and then going out in service to Him among His people, and then spending her end days, if you will, with the Lord in solitude and in prayer. She did die peacefully, and we know that her relics are enshrined at St. Charles in Missouri. And her name is really the first inscribed on the Pioneer Roll of Fame in the Jefferson Memorial Building at St. Louis, Missouri. She was canonized by Pope John Paul II in 1988. And I'd like to read the opening prayer of her Mass, which says, "Gracious God, you filled the heart of Philippine Duchesne with charity and missionary zeal, and gave her the desire to make you known to all peoples. Fill us who honor her memory today with that same love and zeal to extend your kingdom to the ends of the earth." Thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Saints of the Americas was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.